Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore Presents with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. This time I'm meeting Rachel from the Folklore Food and Fairytales podcast, a part-time storyteller who is fascinated, though sometimes alarmed, by vintage cookbooks, enjoys travelling around the world and through time via the medium of food and stories. The podcast features storytelling and folklore with connected recipes and food history, and the importance of honouring the stories despite how tenuous the link to the recipes might become. As well as the podcast, Rachel has a nearly weekly newsletter featuring snippets of folklore, history, stories, vintage recipes, remedies, herblore, and the occasional cocktail. So, in this episode, we're going to talk about all things basically food history, food folklore, and food and fairy tales. So, I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Fabulous Folklore.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. So nice to meet you.
Yeah, at last. When we've only been listening to each other's podcasts for how long?
Yeah, sometime.
When did you start your podcast anyway?
September 2020.
Wow.
So
Where's this time gone, man?
it's its third birthday and I can't believe it. I feel like I should get it a cake.
Well, you could make it a folklore cake.
I could, yeah, perfect. Folklore things on it, yeah.
Speaking of that, if you were going to pick any cake related to folklore, what would you use as a birthday cake?
It's really tricky because I like quite boring cake. I mean, I love it. I don't like it to be too fancy. So I like seed cake. So, and I think probably either seed cake or pistachio cake. And then I'd have to track down, there's always seeds, everything in so much food folklore around seeds. And again, with pistachios, because it's anything that's sort of older. So I think it would have to be that. Or you'd have to choose a fairy tale type one, I think, like a sort of angel cake, very, very sort of fluffy and something that a princess would have, I guess. What you would imagine a princess to have. Something covered in flowers. I don't know. That's a tricky one, actually. Yeah, I don't know. There's so many. There's this is very actually. I'm not going to mention it because it is quite rude. There's a one people can go look it up themselves because it's quite bawdy. But there's a bit of folklore, and it's either called cockle bread or cockle cake, and it's used as because everything is in folklore somehow connected with foretelling your future husband, and that's what I'm going to say. People can go look it up for themselves. Otherwise, you'll have to have one of those warnings.
It's so funny you mentioned that. It was the other day I suddenly realised when I was looking at all these episodes I'd done, I was like, how many have love divination in them?
Yeah,
So I was on Twitter and I was like, I'm gonna have to just write a book about this. And obviously I'll try some of them, for
yeah,
science.
yeah,
But there's absolutely so much of it. It's just who you and you can understand why, because
yeah,
obviously back in the day that would be your only,
yeah,
well, not your only, but one of your main
yeah.
means of
Yeah.
security. But yeah.
Yeah, there's a strange one that's a love divination, which I've always thought was weird. I mean, it's weird even in love divination terms, which is saying something. And it's about the Irish potato and cabbage, the mixture with all the butter. And why you would want to not eat all the delicious potato with lots of butter, I don't know. But you're supposed to put, I think it's the last portion of it in a stocking and hang it over the door. And then the first person that comes through the door with the stocking, presumably dripping with butter at this point, is the person or has the same name as the person that you're going to marry. And it's no, don't eat that. Eat the potato. Just eat the potato and choose another. It just doesn't seem to fit. It's a really weird. Yeah. Anyway, no, probably don't do that one. Not even for science. Plus, wasted mashed potato is a crime, or it should be. Anyway.
Oh, so bearing all of this in mind,
Yeah.
we'll go back to the beginning,
Yeah.
because otherwise, tangent central, I think.
Yeah.
What got you interested in food folklore in the first place?
Food, I think. I know it sounds a bit simplistic, but I'm fascinated by food and how it works and how it brings people together and how it separates people in the sense that it's all the sort of rituals that people have. And so you imagine, like, everyone's got their own, even little things like eating chocolate bars or eating, I don't know, it's nearly Easter, isn't it? Cabbage cream egg. So it's like, how do you eat yours? You know, it's the whole advertising tendency, but everyone eats it differently. And it's almost like if you eat yours a certain way, then that you're in that tribe of people. Like when you're at school, you fit with that people because that's how you eat yours. So like if you eat, I don't know, something by eating all the chocolate off the outside, I do that with Ferrero Rocher. If you eat all the chocolate off the outside of the Ferrero Rocher and then you're left with that weird foam ball with the Nutella in the middle. But it's a ritual, isn't it? When you have that thing that's a treat that's different, or a cabbage cream egg, you only have that once a year or a few, like in a certain period of the year. It's like a food ritual. And I thought, well, that's sort of a thing we have now. But everyone has them in their own home. So it's like if you have, I don't know, a roast dinner, say every week. I'm speaking British here because that's where I'm from, but obviously all over the world, people have their own food rituals. And I mean, obviously, there are religious ones that go into that as well. Obviously, how people eat, whether they have fasts, whether they have prayers before food, and all of those things. But just really, it really brings us together, but keeps us apart by the different ways that we eat food. And that just got me fascinated, because if that's like that now, how much is that, like going back and looking stuff? So I think that's probably what it was. It's that whole thing of it has so many like rituals about it, from very simple ones like eating, some people would, it's disgusting, and probably is, all the chocolate off the outside of Nutella, to quite a simple one where people, I don't know, maybe as a Jewish family, but they always have Friday, they're not particularly religious, but they always have Friday night dinner. So that's the one thing they do when it brings them together. They don't necessarily go through the different things you would of a Sabbath, a traditional Sabbath, but the food itself is still there, you know. And how when people have, like, again, they might do the same thing on a Sunday, like that whole roast dinner. People would have traditionally done it based around church and eating that way, and hence that whole thing of a baker's oven during almost like the church, when the church services were on, things would go in the morning, the whole batter pudding thing with Yorkshire pudding, the meat coming onto it and cooking, and then people would have that food. And that's why they had it on a Sunday, because the baker's oven would have been full in the week. It wouldn't have had the capacity for that type of food, and people didn't have ovens at home. And so I was always fascinated by food history too, and it fills gaps. The folklore fills the gaps, and sometimes is the history, and sometimes the history is the folklore. So because we can't always tell, I think that's part of what I like about it. Because like all history, obviously you have different sources, but food is so, I guess, so intangible, because you eat it, it's gone. And the people that write about it, like most history, are the people who can afford to write about it. The people who, although I think people are mistaken, a lot more people were like literate in the medieval periods than people think. People still had businesses and things like that. It wasn't just like people, but people didn't sort of start to write about food till probably, yeah, I guess 13th century, isn't it? Form of curry, I suppose. But we don't have a lot about it. But the folklore fills in the gaps that the history, there is no history. But also means, and that's quite the fun part, there's all the sort of food folklore myths as well, which is also fun. I mean, you have to accept that that's part of it, because people like to make stuff up to fit a narrative, and so you get that. So you have to sort of weigh up the different things. And I guess it's probably a long answer, but just fascination, probably fascination, and the tribal part of it, and how it's sort of the food rituals, I guess.
I was just thinking when you were saying there about people making stuff up, because I know when I was looking for like cake folklore, I was amazed at how many people were confidently asserting different types of cakes that the Celts made.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh yes, that civilization that famously never wrote anything down.
Yeah. My famous Celtic carrot cake was the one that got me. Carrot cake's like a wartime American invention, as far as I know. I mean, people are very happy. I'm very happy to be proved wrong. But it was a time when there's less sugar, and obviously carrots have got sugar in them. They're quite sweet, aren't they? And so that's how people used that to sweeten. I think they did here too. People had parsnip cake and all sorts of things. Although people shouldn't put beetroot in cake. There should be some sort of law. I once had brownies. Someone bought brownies to work and they put beetroot in them. I think it was supposed to be the thing that you would taste them and say, how delicious. And they would say, oh, they've got beetroot in them. And you would go, oh, I can't believe it had beetroot in them. But you knew it had beetroot. I like beetroot, but it does not belong in a brownie. It tasted earthy, which is great in a beetroot salad and not in a chocolate treat. But yeah, it is that, like you said, the problem is we just don't have I think it's two different things, isn't it? We just don't have, like, the Celts didn't write anything down. So we can probably guess, looking back to sort of some archaeological sources, to work out roughly what people might have been eating, like from different seeds and different things like that. And so you can probably, I mean, I'm far from being an archaeologist, although I always wanted to be one until I worked out how hard it was and how much time you'd have to spend in mud. But the whole thing of, you can look at food, like food dumps and stuff, and you can see, and you can probably work out some really interesting stuff from the people found in bogs, who've been there thousands of years, and they had their stomach contents, and you could look and so you could work out maybe like breads or all sorts of things. Hello. And so you'd have that. But we don't know. So you can just guess. They can work out and guess, and you can maybe put a recipe together based on that. But you can't say that things like the Celts, because we just don't know. It would be lovely, wouldn't it, to be able to say. But people are they're very precious about it. I think it's hard to sort of explain that it doesn't have to be Celtic to be good. It could be from the 14th century, and it's the 14th century. We're making something from the 14th century, and it's the 21st century, 700 years ago, and we're making something similar. That it doesn't have to be Celtic, 700 years is in my feeling, is really impressive, And I think the other side of it, without going into a really strong historical thing, is obviously in the medieval period, we see them in a way that they wouldn't have seen themselves. There was an awful lot more. People think of pagan stuff, but actually they think that there were pagan rituals and things that went on. But actually, a lot of those weren't pagan. They just in the medieval period, they saw things like nature, and it fitted into their Christianity. Actually, it wasn't pagan, but we see it now. It looks more like what pagan seems more like to us now. But to them, they would never have seen it as pagan. So it's that whole folklore ritual for that. And that's, again, another fascinating thing. But they were closer, they were closer to nature because they had a lot more of it. We were an agricultural society back then. And so, but to have things, if you eat something that's from a recipe that's 700 years old and it tastes like something you could eat now, for me, that counts. That's as good as, Celtic would be exciting, but we'll never have that because it was never written down.
Mm. So how often do you ever sort of, when you're doing your research, come across these like really old recipes? Because I'm thinking of like when you watch documentaries and they go to like Hampton Court and they're like, oh, let's recreate one of Henry VIII's banquets or something. Yeah. And a lot of the stuff we wouldn't necessarily recognize, or you'd look at it and just go, oh, well, that's not food, like peacock, for example. But like how often, if you come across an old recipe, do you go, do you know what? I'm going to try that.
I'm not a great one for recreating them, not because I don't think they'd be good, but just because the cooking methods are so different. It isn't necessarily, because obviously we have so much control now in the kitchen. We all say, I've said it myself millions of times, well, my oven temperature it's not consistent. But it's like, it's damn sight more consistent than something would have been in the medieval times. We didn't even have ovens. Like maybe warm, maybe not warm, and stuff was cooked over a fire or on a spit on things underneath and cooked like off the reflected heat of stuff. But there is actually quite a lot of stuff I would make, and I think we have this, and that's another folklore. It is myth. It's a myth that food in this country is dull, and people just don't take into account that. One, we went through a huge, very fast period of industrialization, which damaged our agriculture as it always was going to. And also meant that people who industrial societies eat differently and get their food differently and they cook differently because they, I'm talking sort of the working classes, not necessarily wealthy people here, but we had a massive move from the countryside to the city. We had massive industrialization, and then we followed it up with 2 world wars, which we were not equipped to deal with because we started planting luxury goods in our fields because that was a better return, because we could get peas from overseas, or we could get whatever from overseas. We're much less, even now, we're nowhere near self-reliant, and we wouldn't be, but even now we have much better reliance on our own stuff. And I think at one point we were getting something like, my facts are probably horribly wrong because I am doing it off the top of my head, something like 70% of our wheat came from somewhere else. and we can grow wheat. I mean, lots of it, but it was just like we didn't need to because wheat wasn't a good cash crop. Asparagus is a good cash crop, and with the trains, people could get it to the cities, and people would buy it, and they would spend a lot more money for it, and it didn't need anything like the amount of people to harvest it. So then we came into 2 world wars with that attitude, or with that background, and we had nothing. So there was huge amounts of rationing, there was huge amounts of things, and those 2 world wars over that period meant that we wiped out so much food knowledge for supplies and all those things, because people died in wars, but people had died of old age. And so we then had to sort of try and build it back up from nothing. And of course, in the meantime, there was still, our economy was really struggling. So where a lot of British food is really good, but it's really simple, but it has to come from good ingredients to be good, you know, especially at the higher end. You have to sort of, then it's not going to taste great, because if you use cheap ingredients, it's what people had to do because our economy was so bad. You know, you could still have nice meals, people had still nice meals in their homes, but that was because, and a lot of home cooks spent a lot of time cooking and trying to make things out of nothing because they didn't have much money. So they spent a lot of time basically pulling every bit of flavour out of everything. But that didn't ever appear in restaurants. And so we now talk about our food as being less, you can tell I'm horribly passionate about this, as being sort of less than French cooking. And I love French cooking. But actually, if you look at how we cook and how the French cook, it's not actually that different. Like the proper basic sort of like casseroles and things like that. We use slightly different ingredients. We use slightly different, because of course we do, they're a different country. But actually we're very close geographically, some of our, and so, but if you look at a really good, sort of sort of braising steak with onions that's long cooked. I'm sorry, it's not a great vegetarian reference, but I'm just trying to think of something like my nan used to cook. But that tasted amazing, and it was fantastic, and it was really cheap to cook because you would get those ingredients and you would do a lot with them to get them to taste amazing. And that's what a lot of French cooking is. You know, they'll do quite a lot to it to make it taste that good. They put in layers of flavour with onions, like then with bacon, and we still do the same thing. But people don't compare, like my nan's braising steak and onions. They go to a restaurant where they get like beef that was rubbish because the quality, and potatoes that were undercooked because they didn't have the serving staff or whatever. And so we have this thing of like, you know, we have dull food. But actually, even going back to only the Regency, we had wild recipes and wild ingredients. Like that's probably the Regency period where it started to change a bit from spices, because the Victorians liked French food a lot more. So you went more towards the sort of French cooking and the very traditional French cooking and high class cooking and stuff. But actually, up until the Regency period, we were eating like amazing things. If you read cookery books from the 17th century, they're like fascinating because they're so good. And so we've just had an unfortunate couple of 100 years, maybe 150 years, but you need to look back to see what we were. Obviously our cooking changed, but they just couldn't survive the upsets that happened. And if you look now at people, just look at the British cheese industry and the homemade cheese and look how different it is and how amazing it is. And that's only been done since the 70s. We have all of this skill and all of this knowledge, and this is not folklore specific. But the whole thing about the folklore is British food is rubbish. British food is not rubbish. We just need a bit of time to get back to being good. But looking back at our history again, you know.
I was going to ask actually, where exactly would you look for like a 17th century recipe book? Like, are they like, because obviously I'm thinking of like recipe books like Mrs. Beeton's Doorstops and things like that, obviously from the 19th century.
Yeah.
But like, how well preserved are recipe books? Because with them almost being like household ephemera, did they really survive?
Yes. Yeah, they did. Mostly because they were up to a point, I mean, going back in the period, they were receipt books, but as well as recipes for food, obviously they were for a receipt, there was also medicines and remedies in there. So the lady of the house would have her book and she would write in it, and she would write down recipes and she would write down remedies, and then she might write down other people's recipes as well, you know. That's the problem with 17th, 18th century recipe books and 17th century books. They stole each other's recipes. There are ones where there are big chunks, like, I mean, no word of a lie. It's like, I've read this before. Oh, I mean, I've read this before. It's the same. It happened a lot in the 18th century, but it still happened. But you can have a look, and they would, so that book would then become something that would be passed down, or at least the stuff that was in it. So people would write, the stuff that was good would survive and it would carry on. And it was a valuable thing because it was medicine as well. And so, but then you start to get people writing recipe books, and then you realize how good an index is and how good it is that our current ones, we put them into chapters, because they didn't to start with. They just chucked everything in and you'd be moved from one thing to another. But they start to become, but they were precious then because books were precious then. And so we have now, obviously, quite, like with lots of things, quite a throwaway society, but we forget that books were so expensive. I mean, even post the print, like Gutenberg and stuff, they were still expensive things. So people kept them and passed them down. They were things that you gave to people because they were, worth something. And then you sort of get, once the printing really took off, they just went everywhere and things would be printed. They were quite often the things that you would have. It wouldn't just be like the lady of the house. She might even not even really look at them after that point. It might be like the higher servants, so like housekeepers and cooks, and they could read and write. I mean, they needed to, because they needed to. In those big houses, you couldn't just be ignorant. You were managing massive amounts of budget, really, and it wouldn't just be recipes. It would be telling you how to choose the right meat and what things you should be growing in the garden and how to brew and how to make wine and how to make cheese, depending on the different books. And so they've had a lot of value. Obviously, there'll be ones we don't see now that we've lost forever, but they were stored, and they're strangely one of the things that have been very well archived digitally. So they're quite accessible now for people. Like if you go onto archive.org, you can find loads of them. But even like the Wellcome Trusts, they had a lot of them because of the whole medicine type of thing. So they had the Wellcome Trust, and they've been digitizing all of theirs, and lots of other, and Google have as well as part of the Google Libraries project. So actually, you don't even need to have to go anywhere. But digitization has really helped because people don't need to look at, they can look at them digitally, so there's no damage to the originals. But the Library of Congress as well, and there are the American, there's a huge amount, and obviously a lot of American ones. There's some of the British ones as well because they're the ones that went over there. But there's a big project done by one of the big American universities digitizing cookbooks because they recognize as something that's massive social history project. And so there are a lot out there. You can get access to them very easily. I will happily send you links, but you will end up in a rabbit hole of, like, I don't know, cinnamon. You think, why would you put cinnamon in that? And you think, no, I wouldn't. But they do. They put like cinnamon with fish and all sorts of bizarre things, like if you've got a spice. I think I need to dismiss this is another food myth, is that you put spices with meat because it had the taste of bad meat. Spices cost a lot more than meat. So you wouldn't put spices on bad meat to make meat taste better because you'd be wasting your spices. And it's just something that it was one of those ones where a historian, I don't know if his mum told him it or something, so he wrote it in a book. It didn't have any proper sources, but it took off. And now people confidently assert that that's what happens. It's not. Have a little think about it when it clearly was like spices were expensive. And also people didn't necessarily, although they didn't have the same refrigeration things as us, they also weren't stupid. They knew how to preserve what meat they did have, and they knew when it was off, It wouldn't be, there are some bits, but often they're to do with, there's a couple of really good articles in the Oxford Food History Symposium. They have put all of, apart from the last they don't put the most recent ones on because they still sell the books, but everything up to about 4 or 5 years ago, and every year they put a new one on. They put their proceedings of all their articles on, and people write the weirdest articles about oddest things, and they're just fascinating to read. But those have done a lot of research. They go back to 1981. People were writing about it in 81, and that's when it started, but they've all been archived, and they're on Google as well, so you can just go and look at them. But they did a series of things about sort of how meat, how like food things and how food is spoiled, and it's just, yeah, absolutely fascinating. You can look at the things. The woman gets very cross, I mean, crosser than I am about it, the fact that you would even think that, but she's gone into proper sort of in-depth. It's an area, so I hate the phrase fake law, but food law is so open to fake law because people are so convinced that they're right about it. I think I'm not too bad because most of the time I admit that I have to have a lot of sources before I'll commit to being 100% right, and even then you can't always tell.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I know Delith and I were talking about with when we did Welsh Death Omens, Delith was pointing out that occasionally what happens with those is it's like this one tiny practice happens in this one village, and then people then extrapolate that to like a whole county or even country. And I sort of feel like certain bits of food folklore like that I've come across where it's like someone will refer to it as British, and what they actually mean is it might be Northumbrian, or
Yeah.
it might be solely in London. And it's like, well, I know England, like compared to other countries, isn't maybe the biggest country ever, but there are still regional differences.
Massive.
And I sometimes wonder if that's why having family recipe books is actually really helpful, because then you can trace them by where they're from.
Yeah, I think it really is. And I think what's absolutely fascinating is when people do have family books, like they're properly family recipe books, because you can really see what people, even if they're quite recent, it's really interesting to see how things develop. But also you can definitely see our regional differences. It's with folklore generally, I think, but with food folklore to an extent, just because the ones that were sort of tied in with Catholicism existed for a lot longer around the outer rims of the country, further away from where people would get you into trouble for still, they weren't necessarily, people weren't Catholic, but they held on to those rituals for a lot longer. So like, and areas basically outside of, or further away from London really. And there's a series of ones which talks about, obviously we know about soul cakes and souling, but there are other ones that are connected with the Midlands and Shropshire, where people didn't just do souling, they did different things and on different days, and then people would beg for food, and that was connected. But that didn't exist in London anymore, but it existed in Shropshire for 200 years more, because it was further away, and we forget how bad transport was. Like, we didn't really have
It's just as bad now.
We've got a bus strike. I don't want to talk about it, but everybody has every right to strike for what they feel is the right thing for that's the only way they can get what they need to get, is to withdraw their labour. They're absolutely to do it, but it took me 3 hours to get home tonight. So I think that our transport, but we have the physical ability to get to places. Like, we forget that even like cheeses, like having different cheese from different places available on one plate, is something that didn't happen until 19th century. Like, a lot of those cheeses existed, like local cheeses. It's not that they didn't, but they just didn't go anywhere, because cheese, apart from some of the really harder ones, is difficult to transport, and it goes off, and well, it's not just goes off, but it's breakable and it's fragile, and you're not going to take it 300 miles to London. But in like the form of like Cheshire cheese, which is it's very old cheese, it comes from Roman, and it's to do with, it's because of the salt in the salt that lives beneath Cheshire. The cows eat the grass, and the grass is saltier than normal grass, and the cows eat it, and the milk is saltier, so you get different cheese. I'm not going to go to cheese fermenting because I don't know enough about it, and I'll sound like an idiot. But anyway, the salt's important. But you had Cheshire cheese lived in Cheshire, so you never went it. Daniel Defoe did his like tour of the British Isles, and that's where we start to get the first references to like Cheshire and Stilton as regional cheeses. But in London, they only ate East Anglian cheese because it was close. That's where all the farming was, close to them. But then all the East Anglian farmers would try, they got more money for butter, so they were putting all the cream into the butter, and the cheese went really hard, and they didn't like it. And then someone bought some Cheshire cheese they'd had, and it was like a hit. And then because of the sea transport was better than the land transport, they had all these things that they would go to Liverpool. It's Liverpool, I think it is, yeah. And they would have like the and Chester as well, but they would have cheddar warehouses where local people would bring the cheese. It'd be sold by cheese merchants who were specifically selling Cheshire rather, and then they would go by sea all the way around the outside of the UK to London, and then it would sell for these amazing prices because it was good cheese, and they'd been used to eating really shit cheese, so they had really good cheese. And then they but that's where cheese was first, the instance of cheese piracy, because it was worth so much. It was worth you capturing the boat, and it happened. There were instances of boats being boarded by pirates and stopped. So
That's
yeah,
a Netflix series waiting to happen.
it's cheese based. How can you not like cheese piracy? Find it absolutely fascinating. Ned, again, I told you about this would happen. He's written a book called, it's basically the whole history of Britain in cheese. it's not a thick book really. It's just like, but he writes about like this cheese reflects this period of British history, this one, and this one, and that's where I learned about cheese piracy. And I will forget. I love him forever for it. I'll send you which book it is, but it's absolutely fabulous. But yeah, but but that's the point, is at which piece, Jane Austen in Emma, someone starts talking about cheese, isn't it? Again, it's the first like references and stuff, and that's how we know about it. But we only know bits, because like lots of things, but everyone has this whole idea that, I don't know, that people didn't eat cheese. You don't have a cheese board like we have a cheese board now. It didn't exist because you just didn't have foreign cheese, and you run much. Although you don't have like Parmesan, because like there were cookery books from the 17th century with pasta recipes in, like tortellini, and using Parmesan for other things. So we're 17th century at least. But yeah, in the Renaissance period we started to have. So we're not as far out of the loop with other foods as you'd think we would be. Even if they don't spell Parmesan the same way twice.
Oh, I was still stuck on those cheese pirates. Honestly, I think this is the thing, like, because I knew obviously about people smuggling tea, but the idea of people then stealing cheese, it just...
Yeah, it was really expensive. It was
Fair
worth
enough.
it. It's got to be worth it, hasn't it? If you're going to pirate it, you'd be really miffed, wouldn't you, if you turned out, I don't know, to be Baby Bell or something, and then you...
Oh God, yeah. So what would you say is apart from the cheese pirates, is your favorite example of folklore about food?
I don't know. I've got two, I suppose. One simple, and it's tyromancy, because it is just amazing, and it's how to tell the future in cheese. And so it talks about, you look at cheese, there's different ways of doing it. Like you can use it as like a bit to the same way you use it, put it under your pillow or whatever. Although cheese and pillows don't go together, but they used to do things like that. But other ones, they actually used to take a piece of cheese and they'd look at the veins and things in it, and they would read it the same way that people read like tea leaves and stuff like that. Tyromancy, tyro, I think it's a Greek for cheese, and then the mancy bit like stuff is punditry. But yeah, you can tell the future with cheese. I mean, even if it's only to say that you're going to have a nice dinner, but you can tell the future with cheese, apparently. But they used to give cheese to murderers and then see if they would admit it. Like if they had, it's a bit like the whole sort of ducking stool thing. It wouldn't really matter what you did, you were going to do it. But they would essentially give them cheese, and then they would do different things, and then get them to like basically bless the cheese. And if they couldn't bless the cheese, then they were definitely the murderer. I mean, it was like, yeah, it was weird, very weird. And I'm not going to go into it now because we definitely don't have time. But garlic and folklore of garlic is just astonishing. We'll start with the first one, which is, I love this piece of information, and I tell people, I really hope I'm right when I tell people. I am reading off other people, so I'm hoping my sources are good. But the first ever strike was about garlic. It was the pyramids, and the slaves had allocations of food, and they slashed their garlic allocation, and they stopped working until they got our garlic allocation back.
Yeah, I can understand that.
Yeah. But there's all sorts of garlic was like things for love. It was for protection. It was fertility. It was also just people loved it. So it had so many. It's got so many folkloric things that some of them are vampire based, but very few of them actually. There's just garlic is it's just something you can't even. I suppose you can go into it, but there are there's even like things that the ancient Greeks. Asclepius, who was like the son of Apollo, he's like one of the first doctors and things. He learned from Chiron, who was I want to say a centaur. Yes, like from all the herblore, he learned all of this. And he was at the point he'd managed to defeat mortality, so he could have the secret of making a thing to make you immortal. And Hades was miffed because no death, no Hades really. And so he told Zeus about it, and Zeus wasn't overly thrilled about the fact that so someone who wasn't actually a god had power over life and death. So he did his Zeus thing, and thunderbolts, etc., lightning. No more Asclepius. But where he'd been writing his thing at the point of his death, it burned the ashes and hit the ground, and then a plant grew from where the ashes of Asclepius were, and it was the first ever garlic plant, and that's where garlic comes from. That's the myth. That's where garlic comes from.
So I like that as an origin. I mean, I'm a big fan of Asclepius to start with, but the idea that you'd get such a fabulous, medicinal, and just all around awesome plant.
Yeah.
That's quite a cool origin story, to be fair.
Yeah. So garlic comes from the formula for the like immortal things, and then they said, I mean, it's all about Greek, and this goes back to Greeks, but like Circe, they say that the herb she gave to people to do the thing was wild garlic, so it was moaning, and that's what they translate it to be.
Oh,
And
right.
so it was that, and then they had it like Roman weddings, and it went everywhere because Charlemagne liked it, so it went, it was all the different things, and yeah, people loved it, but it was just this whole, just astonishing. And then it has the other side of it where they said garlic plants went from where Satan's footprints have come from, and that it's, and so it's like, and there are myths about how you could save your husband or stories and you could save your husband from dallying with like a Swedish wood nymph, by get him back by feeding him garlic, and from straying, and it's sacred to Hecate. It's one of the things that's a liminal plant because of the whole life and death thing. And so it's just you could just go down a whole thing, and you could just eat. I think it's amazing anyway, you can eat it, but there's the all the different things to do with it, and all the things to do with Romania, but not the sort of garlic thing. But they have they have garlic parties on St. Andrew's Eve, and like they basically stay up all night and watch the garlic. And again, it comes into love things. There's a Romany thing of growing garlic plants in a pot, and trying to find your true love. And then if you get them and you're not interested, then you have to take the garlic clove and put nails through it and bury it at crossroads, and then they won't be interested in you anymore. So it's like a way of freeing up a person if you want to get them interested, and then you think, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. You could deal with the problem. But I mean, this is like touching the tip of an iceberg. But garlic, if you're interested in food folklore, garlic is the way to go.
I love the way you've just got a little visitor behind you there.
oh, hello. Sorry, it's a small furry. How close are you going to get? Oh, okay. Just don't walk on the keyboard, please. Thank you.
Yeah, Fabulous Folklore is cat friendly. So that's and would you say there's anything, and I know obviously some food folklore is absolutely bonkers. I mean, I'm thinking of that Valentine's Day mash you can make with like earthworms to try and sort of zhuzh up your love life. So obviously some of it does tend to feel a little bit like someone made it up for a laugh and then it spread.
Yeah.
Is there actually anything sort of like useful that we can learn from, and I don't mean like the mythical side of food folklore, but like the beliefs that people thought that some of this food had, like is any of it actually accurate?
Well, I think some of it is. I mean, some of the things you don't want to try. I have a newsletter that I send out, and I do a vintage recipe and a vintage remedy it's most weeks. But I always have the standard disclaimer that says, please seek medical advice, and think about the fact that you're looking at something from the 18th century that I found in a book, before you sort of plan on doing things. But those tend to be remedies, as opposed they're vintage remedies that you find in books, so they tend not to be folklore specific. But I think the one thing is that folklore is quite good at, not necessarily for telling us that something's good, but for telling us when something's bad. So like the whole thing of, there are certain things, obviously the elder plant is poisonous. I mean, some of it very poisonous, some of it not so poisonous, but some of the poison can be tempered with heat. So if you make up a syrup with it, then it's fine for you to have, and it's really good for sore throats. And they found out that using using those syrups and that sort of thing, it has things that we now medically use that are good for sore throats, that are good for bacterial infections and stuff. And it has been, I mean, obviously these tests are not usually on a big scale, but anyway, there are inclinations that there's a reason why else is good for you. But the folkloric thing that I think connects with that, which I think is really useful, is that you always had to ask the elder before you took any part of it. And that, I think, is very much about, that's how folklore is carried on in, this is the plant you want to be cautious about. This isn't a plant you want to be messing with. It's got its uses, but you need to be courteous to the plant before you take its fruits, its leaf, or whatever. So I think that's where folklore is useful. There are lots of things to do with plants and poisonous things, and basically making people wary of stuff, which I think is probably more accurate than the stuff that works, because people knew when things were bad for them, but they weren't necessarily very good at the healing side of it, they'd give it a go, because they just didn't understand medicine the same way that we do, because they were just working on a different, they weren't stupid, they were just working on a different set of assumptions. But you would know if you got poisoning from elder things. That's why you don't make babies' cradles out of elder. It's why you don't necessarily burn elder. I mean, part of that's the horrible cracky sound it makes, but elder is a witch tree. You know, it's all the things to do. It's poisonous, and there's all the folklore that's around you. I mean, I know you've done lots of different things on different plants and stuff, but used so poisonous. But actually, there are things now that said that certain things like anti-cancer, it's been really, I mean, they're developing things. I mean, it's something you don't go and pick things off a yew tree, and you know, but you don't want to make home remedies out of you. But there's so much stuff about you, and that's why people. But I think that's where the folklore is. That's what we can learn from it. When the food folklore tells you, I mean, there's other things like a grinding up of, like, you make bread on Good Friday and you dry it out and then you make a thing out of it and you put water in it. I don't know, that sounds like it ought to work it sounds a bit like early penicillin, but also sounds horrible. So I don't know, it might be early penicillin. If you just put water and bread together, then you will get bread mold. And in some ways that can be good. And obviously that's where penicillin comes from. So maybe that's how they found, like, they didn't know what they were doing, but they saw it because it was a holy thing. That if you put that dried bread in with holy water and then you used it as a medicine. I mean, I don't know whether we're using that folklore because we now know that. I don't know. It's a bit chicken and egg.
Yeah, I think the funny thing that we've always got to be careful about with a lot of the herbalism stuff is obviously how, you know, some people would have like 100% known, oh, if we do this, this, and this. And I think that's why I love it when you look at the, you know, the old English leech books and stuff. And then they've got these really specific instructions where you've got to like recite a charm like 9 times. And we might be like, well, what would be the point of that be? But it's just because it takes you X amount of time to recite it. You do that 9 times, and you've got, if in an era before wristwatches, you've got the exact time in there. And I think it is quite interesting how I think there is a lot of herbal knowledge which obviously has been preserved in other cultures, which I think in the UK in particular we've sort of forgotten. But it has sort of been kind of like hidden under layers and because people will remember the cool stuff, they won't remember, like, because people are like that. You tell someone a fact and it just goes in one ear and out the other. But if you tell them like the cool story around it, then that's the bit that they'll then go and tell somebody else. But I just love the idea of people suddenly going mad for yew trees because I absolutely love them.
I think they're amazing, aren't they? And the age of them and the things they've seen. You know, there's like all the stories about. I did a piece about, is it the Andrick, the one that's down south near London, that essentially they say would have seen like Anne Boleyn and Henry VIII underneath it, and could have been the when it, you know, things were signed. And you think, actually, it could. I mean, goodness knows if that actually happened, but it could have been because it's been there that long. They're just fabulous. Also in graveyards, and graveyards are cool. So, you know,
very, very much so. Also, the other aspect of your podcast is you don't just look at folklore. Obviously, you do something which I kind of don't do, and that's where you look at fairy tales. And when I stopped to think about it, I was like, actually, food does appear quite a lot in fairy tales, probably more than if your only exposure to fairy tales is Disney, you would possibly be aware. So why do you think food plays such a big role in fairy tales?
I think it's a couple of different things, and there's this like, if you separate out folk tales and fairy tales as not quite the same thing. I use fairy tales as a shortcut, and I think most people do because it's just encompasses pretty much everything. But there are some people who look at folk tales as like folk things that essentially non-supernatural. Like they clearly must be, otherwise you'd have to be. But the whole thing is there's no evidence of supernatural, and then there's like fairy tales where there's a fairy godmother, and there are fairies in them. There are things there might be spirits. There are things that are not from this world. So if you sort of split them to two to an extent, and obviously that's something you don't get with Disney. I have problems with Disney, and I have problems with Grimm, and I'm not going to go into them now because we haven't got enough time. And the problem is with Disney, it's too much. There's like everybody's seen the same story, And there are, I want to say, I don't even know, there is a book about Cinderella, the particular tale type that Cinderella comes from. And one woman in the 1890 something wrote about all of the variants that she could track down of fairy tales, and then of Cinderella, just of Cinderella, and the Cinderella story and the sort of offshoots of it. And I think it's like called 292 variants of it. Not stories, that's 292 types, with some similarities of Cinderella. And most people growing up now know Cinderella from Disney. And we've lost all that other, and it's just so sad because not every Cinderella is, and also because of the way, I'm not going to go into it, French fairy tales, and a lot of Disney comes from the French fairy tale route, is very different to the Italian fairy tale route, as in they're both from a patriarchal system. But the fairy tales from France made that they're like they become in the Grimm become much more passive. So the female characters become much more passive. So whereas in the Italian ones, they're still under the patriarchy, they're still under the rule of them, they still have no rights, they can't argue in theory. But the Italian route, they argue. I mean, they might not get at the end of the day, but they have more presence, they have more fight to them. You know, they might give in. They might end up married with children the same way and be princessy, but the way they get there is different. There is like how we would see fairy tales now if Disney had come from the Italian route rather than the French. It would take a better person than me to go into it, but it would be a different world, you know? Like there's an Italian tale where a girl can't find a husband, she's bored, she's got a very rich father and she needs a husband, but she doesn't like any of the men she meets. She's like, I don't like any of these men, just rubbish. And her dad sort of says, well, you've got to get married, so that's just the way of it. And she's like, fine, here's the list of ingredients. It basically, she makes a big marzipan man and magics him to life.
I love it.
And then a woman steals him and she's miffed and she's also pregnant, so she goes after him very pregnant to get him back because she's not having any of it. And she does. I mean, it's a fairy tale, so she does get him back. But they basically go and she gets him and she steals the woman's stuff and they sort of basically run off to the edge of the kingdom. She has her baby, they're together, but she basically made a big marzipan man because she was not happy. She's still a very pregnant lady whose husband disappears, and that happens in other fairy tales. But she wasn't taking it lying down when she, you know, her dad said she had to have a husband. She was fine. I have to have one, but it's going to be my way. And obviously every tale is different. Not all Italian tales are that it's sort of stoppy, but you can see how we would look a bit differently. And that's how, sorry, I've gone completely off topic, but I'm going back. I promise I'm going back. But when you look at folk tales, that is an excellent one with a marzipan man in. I have actually done that on my podcast and I can't remember the name of it. It's from the one, they're written by Giambattista Basile. He wrote these set of stories and they're done in Nepalese dialect. And quite frankly, some of them are filthy. You could not read these to children. I wouldn't read them to my mother. They are shocking, you know, and they're written in that way because that is the way the people in the streets of Naples, he wasn't from there originally. He was a sort of bit of a soldier of fortune. He was a poet. He did this, he did all sorts of things, but he did all these things because his sister was an amazing opera singer and she had all this patronage and stuff, and people loved her and she had all this, and she got him jobs and she got him like moved around the country. But he writes these tales and they're very different to the French tales, which again, but there's a lot more food imagery even in the sort of Calvino more modern but more collected, more modern versions of Italian tales. There's lots more food imagery in them. If you ever read one, you see it, they use food imagery to mean more different things. But even in British stories, in folk tales, because we have a lot of folk tales of our own, food, I think, I'm getting back, see, I promised I would. It's a shortcut really to showing you that food is short for most people through history. There's not enough food to go around. And so people recognize that in the tale. But you have to use a shortcut to basically show you who the good guys are. So if a mother, it's always like a Jack tale, but if a mother has, you know, Jack wants to go off and get his fortune. And his mother says to him, do you want to have, I'll bake you a loaf of bread. Do you want to have all of it with my curse or half of it with my blessing? And sometimes he has elder brothers and they say all of it with your curse, and they go off and they turn to stone. Anyway, he doesn't always have elder brothers. There's lots of variants. But he says, the hero, Jack, says, I'll take half of it with your blessing. And that doesn't sound much to us now. But he was the last son leaving home. He didn't have a dad anymore. His dad was dead. He was leaving a woman on her own to look after herself in a time when that was a difficult thing to do. And he was leaving her with half of the bread. He wasn't taking all of her food stuff he was taking. So it's a symbol of, this is a good guy. It isn't just a sentimental thing. It has real presence in those stories. And it's also the one, when the heroes in the forest or the heroines in the forest, and like it's either a strange old man or a strange old woman comes up and says, I'm very hungry, I want all your sandwiches. And they go, oh, of course you can have all my sandwiches. Then that they're going to be given the key to knowing what the next step is in their journey and their thing. And it's the shortcut to saying this is the hero and his kind, and it's an indication of that. Whereas in the fairy tales where there is that supernatural element, actually food has like this. By the way, this is my opinion now rather than in fact, but some scholars do. I agree with some scholars on some things and some on others, but it gives you a grounding in those fairy tales because it's a thing that everyone has, so there's lots of fairies and floating and silliness. And if you read some of the like amazing stories, the French stories, not necessarily the ones that are the most common ones, but you read, there's I can't pronounce her name, but she was essentially a French aristocrat, and she was married and her husband abused her, so she killed him, and she got away with it. I'm not entirely sure how, no one's entirely sure how, but she had to flee the country for a while. They suspected that she may have been a spy for the crown, and that's how she was allowed to get away with having killed her husband, because people didn't like people killing their husbands. It was not a good thing. And she did she try to kill him and didn't get away with it? Can't remember the exact story, but she went off around the country, and then she came back and she wrote these tales, and these tales are of like islands that you would never imagine and places that you would never imagine. And so the food in those brings you down to earth a little bit, so it lets you have that connection that you wouldn't have because you've never seen these amazing islands, you've never seen these flights of imagination. I hope that's a decent answer to the question. Sorry, but of course if there's actual fairies in, it's all about the obligation. So it's whether they're going to trap you or whether you're going to trap them. It's all about
that was the thing that always got me with fairies, because obviously we've got quite a lot of like fairy stories in the sense of actual fairies in Northumberland, and they do involve food, and it's nearly always don't eat anything that they offer you. But like you should leave decent stuff out for them. And and then obviously they'll hopefully either just leave you alone or bestow blessings on you. And you do just kind of think like, now, like if I was just out and about and like I just came across this random like I don't know plate of bread and cheese, I'd be like, ew, I don't know who like what dog sneaked on that. I'm not having that. But I suppose it's a good point. Like obviously back in the day, you'd be like, score, someone's left their bread and cheese and it hasn't gone mouldy. So I'd never really thought about that before, because otherwise you do look at them and just go, ew. Because obviously we've got quite a place of privilege, I guess, when it comes to food security.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's lots of people who don't have access to it, but that doesn't mean there isn't any food. It just means there isn't any money. It's not quite the same thing. Whereas then there just wasn't any food, no matter how much, if they were in a famine, if there'd been a bad season, if this didn't grow, there was nothing. And so they were much more precarious. And so you have that. That's what the thing is. But equally, there's the whole thing with the fairies in the sense of that if you'd done them a favour, and as you'd done them a favour, they gave you food, it was actually bad luck not to eat it in some places. And like the people that did eat it went on to have lucky lives, but they were only lucky lives. They weren't like amazing, exciting, all your wishes granted lives. They were just contented. Like their farm always did well, and then their chickens always got, they won all the best for their vegetables, and they were contented, and they had a husband, and they were happy, healthy children. They were things that for us, I'm like, that's a bit average, that's not really a thank you.
I don't know,
But
like
in a
I would be fine
time,
with that.
yeah, but in a time with that, when that was something that was not achievable for a lot of people
Mm.
because of the amount of all the things that people died, farms failed, things. So actually, just having contentment, and I think that's why I like folk tales as well. I mean, fairy tales are nice. I like a folk tale. I like the almost the sort of, things happen that are exciting and interesting, and sometimes it's like you've always got the thing of disbelief. I read one once. There's a fantastic Italian tale about a girl that ends up hidden in a massive candlestick. Don't know, don't care. Excellent novel, excellent story, wonderful. I think I have definitely done it, because it's a dearest salt variant. The whole thing of, if you loved me, I love you more than salt, etc. Well, you can't love me then, and then eventually the dad ends up having to eat something without any salt, and then he realizes he's been an idiot. But this story got to that via a giant candlestick.
I mean, we've all been there.
A giant candlestick and an excellent mother-in-law, which is not something you hear of a lot in stories, but yeah. So
That's the point, actually. I think that's one of the things that I don't like about fairy tales as a whole. That, like, unless you're the female heroine, any
yeah,
women in these stories do not come out well,
yeah,
particularly like stepmothers and mothers-in-law. And if there's one category of joke I hate, it's the mother-in-law joke, because you just sort of think, like, what a way to tar everyone with the same brush.
yeah, yeah. I think there are a lot of, I think, again, I think part of the problem with that, and I try really hard, because those are my beliefs. I try and highlight stories where it isn't necessarily about the sort of princess who goes on to be the heroine and it's all happy never after in a castle. I try and find as many stories I can where it's about strong female characters, or it's not necessarily, it can be a strong male character, but the whole story is not about super tradition. And there are loads of them. It's just you have to look a bit further than most people look. Even old tales, you don't have to, you can adapt them. And I wouldn't take a story that was one thing and make it into another, because that's not an adaptation, that's just a different story. But there are stories where you can just shift them a little bit. They don't take much pushing to fit better into the way we think now about lots of different things. And I try and find those as much as possible, because there are a lot more stories about cleverness, which are interesting, both male and female. There's no gender, there's a bit of sort of trickster bits in, and there's all sorts of interesting, funny, but I think we've got too much. I mean, obviously you have to have, there's a reason for those princess and marrying and happy ever after stories, and one of the reasons is a very old reason, in that the king traditionally would be associated with the land, and he was part of it. Like, what hurt the land hurt him, and what hurt him hurt the land. They were very tightly tied together. And then he would need, but the queen would be part of the fertility of the land. So he would have to have children, and the queen and the princess that becomes the queen becomes part of that whole fertility thing, which is the land. It isn't just a silly story that we don't have to think about now because we're all independent women. Obviously, that's great, and we are, and feminism has a long way to go, but it has got further than that. We shouldn't, but we've made it all about the glittery dresses and the ball, and we've moved away from the real reason for that type of story, which is another fascinating thing. I mean, I learned that from a fantastic storyteller, and I hadn't really put that into perspective either. And Amy has basically said that that's the case. You have to look at it. Some stories are very old, but they've changed their outfits, and that's what's happened with those princess sort of stories. I've just did bunny ears. Sorry, I've just realised that I've just done that on video. It's not very helpful, is it, for a podcast?
I know, it was quite funny. There's a meme doing the rounds that you see periodically where it's like, sort of like it's usually like a guy in armor on a horse, and it's just kind of got the writing over it, and it's something like, my girlfriend wanted me to treat her like a princess, so I sold her off, or I married her off to the Prince of France to cement the alliance or something. And I just always thought that was because the whole people wanting to be a princess things never really sat well with me, because
Yeah,
of the role that you would play politically wasn't
yeah,
necessarily that exciting.
yeah,
Um, and obviously, like, me growing up when I did in sort of like the 80s, it was like the only princess that you really wanted to be was like Leia. And then you get into the 90s and you get Xena. Or
Everyone
She-Ra
wanted to
maybe.
be Xena Warrior Princess. I mean, the character, not necessarily the person.
But so I kind of find it quite funny, to then go back and actually relook at these from the point of view that actually, like, if you take the Disney sheen off them, they're actually saying something very different.
Yeah, there is I'm reading an amazing book that talks about the role that women played in medieval society and how that it's not food related, sorry. Well, there is food in it, but it's not. But it's all about how it's made because of the assumptions and the things that were made about women. And actually, we don't need to change women. We need to change assumptions, because there are a lot of assumptions made about the medieval period which are not true. We don't know enough about it. We sort of skip it. It's like everyone's got, I don't know, wimple hats, or they're peasants, and then we move away, but we don't look at why things were the way they were for women then. And also that women weren't, most of, like in all times, a lot, it's only really wealthy women who, it wasn't only like, there were lots of people who, for working class women, worked when they worked in the fields and stuff, and it talks about the look of women and how at the time there was obviously the ideal beauty standard, but one of the things was to have like a little bit of a paunch, to have a bit of a tummy, and that was like the beauty standard, because working women, peasant women, didn't have a paunch because they were raising babies and they were out in the fields, and there wasn't huge, or there was food, there wasn't huge amounts of it, and there was no extra calories, and what you had you were burning off. So people were skinny because that was it. And so to be rich, not to be overall the sort of medieval beauty fantasy, it's not of someone who's really curvy, but to have that, like that little tummy, was part of the ideal, because it meant you were rich, because only rich women got fat. They weren't fat because it didn't like to be, because obviously it's medieval times, so you needed to be perfect, but you weren't allowed to try and be perfect. But it's talking about how we have this whole different attitude to, people forget that like women worked because they had to work to feed their families, and it's the whole sort of, we have this very idealized view, I think, or can have a very idealized view of the past, when actually that's only a very small window of what's real. Sorry, completely off topic again. I can't help it. I've just gone down.
It's fine.
Fascinating.
I think it is also important though to know, obviously, for the nature of the type of folklore that I often cover, is the fact that a lot of it, and the reason why it's difficult to pinpoint like what's, and I'm going to do the air quotes, what's, quote unquote true, is that because a lot of the folklore was really the law of, like, I don't want to say the common people, because A, it'll make us think of pulp, and B, just because I hate that term, but
Yes.
it's like, just ordinary people, people didn't think to write down what they were doing because it wasn't deemed interesting enough.
No.
And you think, but at the same time, like, I used to know someone back in the day who was obsessed with the idea that she should have been born in the Victorian era.
Yeah.
Her only reason for thinking this was because of the fact that she wanted to be able to wear like corsets and like hobble skirts all day. That was her thing. It's like, mate, you're a goth in the 20th century.
You could
Like,
do that anyway, can't you?
yeah,
Sure.
you're fine. Crack on. You can also vote now, and have penicillin and paracetamol and all these wonderful things,
Yeah.
and dental care.
Yeah.
But but she had it in her head she wanted to be a Victorian. I'm thinking, yeah, but you're picking a very specific level of society that you want to be a Victorian. I'm pretty sure you don't want to be a Victorian servant.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that we sometimes forget when you look at folklore. It's not of the people who were like, living in Belgravia, and the woman had sort of time on her hands kind of thing. It would be just bog standard ordinary people surviving.
Yeah. And it's fascinating. It's like the thing of, it's like, I think people also had this idea that everyone was completely illiterate, and they weren't. They definitely weren't. But like you said, it isn't that they were illiterate, they didn't write stuff down, they just didn't think it was needed to, or it was just such knowledge that people knew it. So why would you write it down? Everyone knows that. And that wasn't the way people learned. They learned from watching other people do things. Or I don't know, if you're going to do tanning leather, they didn't write down how to tan leather. They just got a lad in who was like 8 and went, watch your Uncle Steve or your Uncle Ethelred. And you know what I mean?
And now we just go, oh, it's all right, I'll look on YouTube.
but that's how people learn things, you know. It wasn't a physical thing, so things were more practical because it was a different world, and they had a different, you know, we were obviously mostly an agricultural society. It was very different to what we are now, not just because I think I get frustrated as well that people think people in the past were stupid. So they weren't stupid. They were dealing with the facts as they knew them and doing the best they could with what they thought was the thing. We're just benefiting because we know more, but we're not more clever than them. We've just got a different set of facts and assumptions to work from, and because we have like more science, we're probably more right than they were. But they didn't have that, so you can't base your assumption. They weren't stupid. They were like us, but they just didn't have as much to work with.
Yeah, and I must admit, I would question when you consider that like humans have never had this much access to this much information,
Yeah.
and yet the amount of misinformation and disinformation that we
Yeah.
continue to share. I don't necessarily think humans are any more intelligent than they've ever been.
People eating like laundry washing pods.
Exactly. It's just,
But people do that, and it's just, yeah, we definitely know cleverer. In fact, I think sometimes we're less clever.
well, this is the thing. Like, I'll have people sort of say to me, like, "Oh, what's the point in folklore?" And I'm like, "Yeah, but you're one of those people who also thinks that you shouldn't eat food with ingredients you can't pronounce.
Yeah.
So, what's the difference?"
Yeah, I'm not. I have views. I have views about diet culture, which is just not the place for. We're not going to go that way. I'm just going to say that women should be allowed to take up the amount of, all people should be allowed to take up the amount of space they need. And I don't think that suggesting that you need to take up less space is something that everyone needs to hear. I think we'll leave it at that. But I just get frustrated, and I think we have all these different influences that people never had before, and people don't necessarily use it for good. I think it's probably the best way to do it. But I think the difference is that people used to be much more desperate for knowledge because knowledge wasn't available. And now we have so much knowledge, we just don't know what to do with it. And people are happy to just accept. There's almost so much that people are happy to just, this is my own personal view and based on nothing except for my own feelings. So I'm going to set that out there. But I just think that people, there's too much almost. And it's like, well, it's a bit like when people always have the same thing in a restaurant. It's like, there's too much, I'm just going to have chips. So, but you could have, I don't know, this and this and this. It's like, yeah, but I know I like chips. And that's how they look at the world of knowledge. And it's just a shame, really, because there's so much out there that there wasn't before, just because the way the world's been, so much of it's digitized, you know, so much of it's available for free there wasn't before. You know, you haven't got to get a monk to write it. Sorry, you have to cut this out. One thing I did learn today is that somebody in Victorian Birmingham bought one of the Shakespeare folios, and he bought it for the people of Birmingham in perpetuity, so the people of Birmingham would have access to something rare and special, and they could go and see it whenever they wanted. And it lives in the Library of Birmingham, and it's going on a little tour of Birmingham later this year to different boroughs, so we can have a bit of a day out, so people can see something that's really. But how amazing is that someone thought about that? They went, "That's pretty good. That is." Normal people don't generally get to have a go at that. I'm going to buy it for him. That is essentially what they did.
Yeah.
So.
Oh. Well, speaking of free knowledge and
Yes.
things that are available gratis,
Yes.
would you like to push, publicize, promote your offerings?
Yes. I have my podcast, Folklore, Food and Fairytales, which I love the title of, but I wished was shorter now. But also comes out once a month. It's usually about half an hour long. Sometimes I have specials, sometimes I do interviews. I've got like a couple of interview series where I've talked about, they're a bit different to the standard one where I have a story and then I look at the folklore and about the food, and in the story and there's a recipe. I do have to admit that the link between the recipe and the story is occasionally tenuous. But you know, I've got an excellent recipe for garlic pasta, so you have to go with it. But equally, I did a series with storytellers talking about food and how food breaks down barriers between people. And I did a series of other interviews like a year later with food writers, asking them similar sorts of questions about how they felt the things that happened. And I really enjoyed them. And I feel that they are underappreciated. So if people would like to go and listen to those as well as my normal episodes, I'd love it. And I have a Substack like, because not just because everyone got one, but because I just got fed up of Twitter, because I wanted to write more and I had so much leftover research from researching things. I got excited about stuff and I wanted to share like my stuff with people. And it's free and it will always be free because I don't want to make it that you can't access it. Just because also because some of it's nonsense and my own nonsense, and I don't think that I should inflict payment on the nonsense. Obviously, I'm very happy if people want to contribute towards the costs of running things, but the Substack is, it will be free. I don't know, unless somebody's try and put it into a book. But I have, it's usually story connected, or it might be like this last one was about the Persian New Year and like stuff that appeals to me and appreciate. And people might like the nonsense if you're a nonsense person, or you might just like a vintage recipe, even if it's something that makes you go, ugh. Yeah. But yes, so there's that. But that's it. I don't have anything else. So but I'm not really on Twitter as much as I used to be. I'm trying to make Mastodon work in that way, and it does and it doesn't. But people can get in touch with me still via Twitter, even though I'm not on it loads. I'm on Instagram and I'm on Fairytales Food on both of those, and I'm Fairytales Food at Mastodon. I'll send you the link because Mastodon needs to sort its handles out. They're too long. But
I don't even remember mine.
well, Fairytales Food is mine for everything. It's the only reason I remember, and I think it's Mastodon. It's not .social. It's I don't know. Like I'm the same. I don't remember mine. And then I have a website which is Hestia's Kitchen, which also has a side bit about cheese. If you're interested in cheese, I went a bit mad of cheese for about a year, and it's got lots of pictures of cheese and like little things about where cheeses come from, what wine is nice with it, and what like sparkly pop is nice with it as well, and stuff like that. And that's Hestia's Kitchen, and people are welcome to contact me through that contact sheet as well, and through Instagram. And I'm very happy to talk about food, folklore, or stories at any given time, to be honest. So please come and chat with me. And even if you tell me, I mean, be nice about it, but even if you disagree with what I have to say, I'm very happy to hear what people have to say, because I'm not always going to be right. And people will have a different perspective or a different source, and it'd be fab to talk about those things, because I'm not always going to be right. And so I'm happy to have that too, but it's got to be done nicely so I don't get offended and have to go and eat more cheese.
Oh, well, on that note, yeah, I'm not quite sure how to make some kind of like cheese finale to this whole thing. But quickly, does it give you nightmares? Yes or no?
No.
Fair
Much
enough,
more likely to
go
make
and
you
have-
sleep because of the tyrosine in it.
Oh. So now you know. Well, it's been lovely having you on the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been fabulous. Thank you for letting me talk for ages about my favourite subject.
And cheese pirates.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.